Sometimes the people we walk past on the street carry pieces of our own heart. Sometimes a simple act of kindness can unlock the deepest mysteries of our past. David sits outside a Seattle cafe, watching strangers throw away more food than he's seen in days. When a wealthy woman steps out with leftovers, he asks the question that will change everything. Can I eat your leftovers? Margaret Chen is known for her cold business deals, but something about this homeless man makes her stop. She invites him inside for a real meal. Instead, as they talk, strange coincidences emerge. They both hum the same tune when nervous. They both have scars above their left eyebrow. They both remember fragments of the same lullaby. Neither knows they were torn apart 30 years ago when their parents died in a car crash. What happens when two broken souls discover they were never really strangers? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning rain drummed against the windows of Café Luna like fingers tapping an impatient rhythm. David Chen pressed his face closer to the glass, watching well-dressed people inside sip their expensive coffee while he counted the coins in his worn leather wallet. $3.47. Not enough for even a cup of black coffee in this part of downtown Seattle. His wallet was a relic from better times, cracked and faded but still holding together like the last thread of his dignity. Inside, tucked behind his expired bus pass and food stamps card, was a photo so creased and water-stained that the faces were barely visible. A family of 4, smiling at some long-forgotten celebration. David couldn't remember who they were anymore, but something about the woman's eyes reminded him of someone important. 20 blocks away, in the glass tower that bore her company's name, Margaret Chen stood at her corner office window, watching. The same rain streaked down identical panes. At 42, she had built Chen Enterprises from nothing into a multi-million-dollar consulting firm. Her reputation in the business world was legendary, ruthless in negotiations, brilliant in strategy, and utterly uncompromising when it came to results. But success had come at a cost. Margaret's penthouse apartment echoed with emptiness, her refrigerator stocked with takeout containers she rarely finished. She worked 16-hour days, not because she loved the work, but because silence made her restless. In quiet moments, she found herself humming a tune she couldn't name, a melody that seemed to come from somewhere deep in her childhood. Margaret's assistant knocked softly on the door. Your lunch meeting was canceled. Would you like me to order something from Café Luna? No, I'll go myself. The words surprised even Margaret. She hadn't left the office for lunch in months. Down on Pine Street, David pulled his thin jacket tighter against the October chill. The cardboard he'd been sleeping on was soaked through, and his shoes had given up pretending to be waterproof weeks ago. He'd been homeless for 8 months now, ever since the construction company he worked for went bankrupt, and he couldn't make rent on his studio apartment. The foster system had taught him early that people were temporary. Families were something. That happened to other children. He'd aged out at 18 with no one to call, no safety net to catch him when the world knocked him down. Over the years, he'd learned to be invisible, to ask for help only when desperation overrode pride. Margaret stepped into Café Luna's warmth, shaking raindrops from her expensive coat. The familiar sense of coffee and fresh pastries filled her senses, but today they seemed muted, like a song played in a minor key. She ordered a turkey sandwich and soup, then changed her mind and doubled the order. She wasn't sure why. As she waited for her food, Margaret found herself studying the people around her. A young mother fed pieces of muffin to her toddler. An elderly man read a paperback novel, his lips moving slightly with the words. When was the last time she'd really looked at people instead of seeing them as obstacles or opportunities? Outside, David watched her through the window. There was something about the way she held herself confident, but somehow lonely, that reminded him of his own reflection in storefront windows. When she emerged with a bag of food, he knew this was his moment. "Excuse me," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The words felt like stones in his throat. "I don't mean to bother you, but I was wondering." He gestured toward the bag in her hands. "Can I eat your leftovers?" Margaret stopped walking. Most people looked through David, as if he were invisible, but her eyes met his directly. For a moment that stretched longer than it should have, neither of them spoke. There was something familiar in his face, something that made her chest tighten with an emotion she couldn't name. "You're hungry," she said. It wasn't a question. David nodded, embarrassed by the simple truth of it. "I haven't eaten since yesterday morning." Margaret studied his face, the hollow cheeks, the eyes that held more kindness than bitterness despite whatever had brought him to this corner. He was younger than she'd initially thought, maybe late 30s, with prematurely gray hair and hands that looked like they'd known honest work. "When did you last have a hot meal?" she asked. David hesitated, unused to such direct concern from a stranger. "Maybe a week ago. The shelter serves dinner, but they've been full." Margaret made a decision that surprised them both. "Come with me. There's a restaurant around the corner. Let me buy you lunch." David's first instinct was to refuse. He'd learned that charity from wealthy strangers often came with strings attached, expectations that made him feel smaller than he already was. But something in her voice was different, not pity, but recognition, as if she saw him as a person rather than a problem. "I don't want to trouble you," he said. "It's no trouble." Margaret realized she meant it. For the first time in months, maybe years, she was doing something simply because it felt right. "I'm Margaret." "David," he replied, extending a hand that was cleaner than she'd expected. They walked to Chen's Garden, a small Chinese restaurant that Margaret had never noticed despite passing it daily for 5 years. The owner, an elderly woman with kind eyes, seated them without comment or judgment. Margaret watched David's face as he studied the menu, noting how his eyes lingered on the prices. "Order whatever you like," Margaret said, "and don't look at the right side of the menu." David's smile was the first genuine expression she'd seen from him. "You're very kind." "I don't understand why you're helping me." "I don't understand it either," Margaret admitted. "But you asked a simple question, and I had a simple answer. Sometimes that's enough." As they waited for their food, Margaret found herself really talking to someone for the first time in months. Not strategizing or negotiating, just talking. David had an easy way of listening that made her want to fill the spaces between his words. "What did you do before?" she asked. "For work, I mean." "Construction. Building things with my hands." David flexed his fingers, remembering the satisfaction of seeing concrete take shape, of creating something solid and lasting. "I was good at it, reliable. But when the economy shifted and the projects dried up, he shrugged. "Nobody wants to hire someone without an address." Margaret nodded, understanding more than he might expect. "It's hard to start over." "Were you always in business?" David asked. "No, I started as a social worker. Wanted to help kids in foster care." Margaret's voice carried a note of something regret, maybe, or old sadness. "But I learned that good intentions don't pay rent or put food on tables. Money talks louder than compassion in this world." "That's cynical," David said gently. "That's realistic," Margaret replied, but her tone had softened. "Though I suppose sitting here with you suggests I haven't completely given up on compassion." There, conversation was interrupted by the arrival of steaming plates of food. David hadn't realized how hungry he truly was until the aroma hit him. He ate slowly, savoring each bite, but Margaret noticed his restraint, the way he carefully rationed each portion as if the meal might disappear. "There's more coming," she assured him, signaling the waitress for additional servings as they ate. Small details began to emerge. David mentioned growing up in various foster homes around the Seattle area. Margaret spoke about her own childhood, though she kept the details vague. Both had learned early that family was a luxury they couldn't afford. "Do you remember much about your early childhood?" Margaret asked, surprising herself with the personal question. David paused, a spoonful of soup halfway to his mouth. "Fragments. Pieces of things that might be memories or might be dreams. There was music, a woman singing, and someone who called me Davy." He smiled sadly. "Silly things that probably don't mean anything." Margaret felt something shift in her chest, like a door opening in a room she'd kept locked for years. She had similar fragments, half-remembered lullabies, a feeling of safety that she'd never quite been able to recapture. "Sometimes our minds protect us by hiding painful memories," she said softly. "Maybe. Or maybe I'm just getting old and sentimental." David's laugh held no bitterness. 39 next month, and I still dream about people I probably never even knew." Margaret went very still. 39? "When's your birthday?" "November 15th. "Why?" The spoon slipped from Margaret's fingers, clattering against her bowl. November 15th was her birthday, too. The coincidence felt too large to dismiss, too strange to ignore. "Margaret, are you all right?" She looked at David's face again, really looked at it this time. The shape of his eyes, the way he tilted his head when he was thinking. And there, just above his left eyebrow, was a small scar, crescent-shaped, like the one she saw in her mirror every morning. "I'm fine," she lied, her heart beginning to race. "Just tired." But Margaret Chen was not fine. For the first time in her carefully controlled adult life, she felt as if the ground beneath her feet was shifting. The logical part of her mind insisted it was merely coincidence shared birthdays weren't uncommon, and scars could be explained a dozen different ways. The deeper part of her mind, the part that still hummed lullabies she couldn't name, whispered that some coincidences were too perfect to be accidental. Margaret couldn't concentrate on work the rest of the afternoon. She kept thinking about David's face, the way his voice had sounded when he mentioned dreaming about people he'd never known. After their lunch, she'd given him her business card and enough money for a hotel room. But something about their encounter felt unfinished thought. By 5 o'clock. She'd made a decision that would have surprised anyone who knew her. Instead of staying late at the office as usual, Margaret locked her desk drawer and headed home. But as she reached for her keys, something made her pause and pull the drawer back open. In the very back, behind tax documents and old contracts, was a manila folder she hadn't touched in years. Inside was a single piece of sheet music, yellowed with age and worn soft at the edges. The title read, "Mommy's Lullaby," in a child's handwriting that might have been her own. She'd found it among her few possessions when she aged out of foster care, though she had no memory of writing it. Margaret hummed the melody softly, and a chill ran down her spine. It was the same tune David had been humming during lunch, almost unconsciously. When he paused between bites of his soup, she drove to the modest hotel where she'd paid for David's room, her hands trembling slightly on the steering wheel. This was ridiculous, she told herself. Successful businesswomen didn't chase after homeless strangers based on shared melodies and matching scars. But her rational mind was losing the argument to something deeper, something that felt like hope mixed with fear. David was sitting on the bed when she knocked, looking overwhelmed by the simple luxury of clean sheets and running water. He'd showered and shaved with the hotel's complimentary toiletries, and without the layer of street grime, Margaret could see more clearly how much he resembled someone. The feeling was maddening, like trying to remember a word that stayed just out of reach. "I wanted to check on you," she said, though that wasn't entirely true. "And I have something I'd like to show you." She handed him the sheet music, watching his face carefully. David studied it for a long moment, his brow furrowed in concentration. "This melody," he said slowly. "I know this melody. I've been humming it for as long as I can remember, but I never knew it had words." He began to sing softly, his voice rough but surprisingly melodic. "Close your eyes, my little star. Mama's here though night seems far. ... Margaret's breath caught. She knew those words, had heard them in dreams she could never quite remember upon waking. "Where did you learn that song?" "I don't know. It just ... It's always been in my head." David looked up at her, confusion and something like recognition battling in his eyes. "Margaret, what's happening here? Who are you?" "I don't know," she whispered, but even as she said it, pieces of a puzzle she didn't know she'd been carrying began to shift and align. "David, can you tell me about your earliest memory? Not the foster homes, but before that." David set the sheet music aside and was quiet for a long time. "There was an accident," he said finally. "A car accident. I remember being very scared, and there was a lot of noise sirens, people shouting. Someone was holding my hand, but I couldn't see who. And there was blood." He touched the scar above his eyebrow unconsciously. "Everything after that is just different houses, different families who weren't really families." Margaret felt the world tilt slightly. She sat down hard in the room's single chair, her legs suddenly unsteady. "How old were you?" 7, maybe 8. The social workers said I was traumatized, that I'd blocked out most of what happened before. David was studying her face now, seeing something there that made his voice grow urgent. "Margaret, you're scaring me. What is it?" She pulled out her phone and scrolled through her photos until she found what she was looking for, a carnal, scanned copy of the only photograph she had from her childhood. It showed a family of 4 at what looked like a birthday party, a man and woman who might have been parents, and 2 children who couldn't have been more than 6 or 7. David took the phone from her hands, staring at the image. "That's me," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "That little boy, that's me. But who is—" He looked at the little girl in the photo, then at Margaret, then back at the photo. "Oh my God, David." Margaret's voice was shaking. "What if we weren't strangers? What if we just forgot?" The silence in the hotel room was deafening. David stood up abruptly and began pacing, running his hands through his still damp hair. "This is impossible. This is absolutely impossible. People don't just families, don't they?" Margaret asked quietly. "How many children get separated after accidents? How many siblings lose track of each other in the system?" She thought about her years as a social worker, the files full of broken families and children who'd been scattered like leaves in the storm. David stopped pacing and turned to face her. "If this is true, if we're really—" He couldn't finish the sentence. "Where have you been for 30 years? Where have I been?" "Building separate lives, becoming separate people, surviving." Margaret stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city lights. "I became successful because I told myself I didn't need anyone. Maybe you ended up on the streets because you never stopped believing that someone was out there looking for you." "Maggie," David said suddenly, and the word hung in the air between them like a bridge across time. "I used to dream about someone named Maggie, a little girl who used to sing with me." Margaret turned from the window, tears she hadn't felt in decades gathering in her eyes. "Davy," she whispered back. "I used to dream about a little boy named Davy who was afraid of thunderstorms." They stared at each other across the small hotel room, 2 middle-aged strangers who might be something else entirely. The recognition wasn't dramatic. It was quiet and deep, like water finding its own level. "I can't just accept this," David said, though his voice suggested he already had. "There has to be proof, records, something official." "There will be," Margaret agreed. "But David, look at us. Look at what we both know that we couldn't possibly know. Listen to how we both sing the same song that doesn't exist anywhere else in the world. David sat back down on the bed, the weight of 30 years of loneliness suddenly pressing against his chest. "I have a sister," he said, as if testing the words. "I have a sister, and she's been 20 blocks away this whole time." "You have a sister who walked past you every day and never knew she was walking past home," Margaret replied, her voice thick with emotion she rarely allowed herself to feel. They spent the next hour sharing fragments of memory, pieces of childhood that had survived trauma and time. David remembered Margaret being afraid of the dark, so he would sneak into her room and tell her stories until she fell asleep. Margaret remembered David's collection of bottle caps, how he would arrange them in elaborate patterns on their bedroom floor. Neither of them remembered their parents clearly, but they both recalled feeling safe, feeling loved, feeling like they belonged somewhere. Until the accident that took everything away and scattered them into different lives, different stories, different kinds of survival. "What do we do now?" David asked as the evening grew late. Margaret looked at her brother, and for the first time in years, she didn't have a strategic plan or a calculated next move. "I don't know," she admitted. "I've never been someone's sister before. Not that I can remember." "I've never been anyone's brother either," David said. "At least, not for the last 30 years. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, both of them processing the magnitude of what they'd discovered. Finally, Margaret stood to leave. "Will you stay here tonight?" she asked. "I mean, you don't have to. I can arrange something more permanent, an apartment or..." "Margaret." David's voice was gentle but firm. "I'm not going anywhere. For the first time in my adult life, I'm not going anywhere." As Margaret drove home to her empty penthouse, she realized that her entire sense of self was shifting. She wasn't just Margaret Chen, the successful businesswoman who needed no one. She was someone's sister. She was Maggie, who had been missed and mourned and dreamed about. The city looked different from her car windows, less hostile and more full of possibility. Somewhere in the building behind her, her brother was probably lying awake, staring at the ceiling and trying to process the same miraculous impossibility that had turned their worlds upside down. Tomorrow, there would be questions to answer and proof to gather. There would be DNA tests and official confirmations, legal documents and practical considerations. But tonight, for the first time in 30 years, neither of them would go to sleep alone in the world. Margaret arrived at her office the next morning with a plan that surprised even her methodical mind. She'd spend most of the night researching employment law and housing assistance programs, her business skills finally put to use for something that mattered more than profit margins. She called David's hotel room first thing. "How did you sleep?" "Better than I have in months." His voice carried a warmth she was beginning to recognize as specifically his. "But I've been thinking, Margaret. I can't just let you take care of me. I need to contribute something. Actually, I have an idea about that. Would you be interested in working for my company? Nothing complicated, building maintenance, general repairs. I know you said you were good with your hands." There was silence on the other end, and Margaret worried she'd overstepped. "David, you don't have to do this because of what we discovered." "I'm not doing it because we're family," Margaret said, though the words still felt strange on her tongue. "I'm doing it because my building actually needs someone with your skills, and because you need work. It just happens that I trust you more than I'd trust a stranger." David's chuckle was soft. "When you put it that way." An hour later, David arrived at Chen Enterprises wearing clothes Margaret had sent over, simple work pants and a company polo shirt that fit him better than anything he'd worn in months. Margaret's assistant, Janet, did a double take when she saw him. "This is David Chen," Margaret announced, noting Janet's surprise at the shared last name. "He'll be handling maintenance and repairs in the building. Please set him up with security, access, and an employee ID." Janet, who had worked for Margaret for 6 years, had never seen her boss take such personal interest in a new hire. "Of course, Miss Chen. Should I prepare the usual paperwork?" "Yes, and David, I've arranged for you to have the apartment above Chun's Garden restaurant. The owner, Mrs. Liu, is a friend. It's modest but clean, and you'll have your own space." David felt a mixture of gratitude and discomfort. Everything was happening so fast, and part of him worried that he was dreaming, that he'd wake up on the street corner where this had all began. But when he touched the hospital bracelet he still wore, faded and barely legible after all these years, he felt anchored to something real. The bracelet was a mystery he'd carried since childhood. The nurses at one of his early foster homes had wanted to cut it off, but David had fought to keep it. He couldn't read what it said anymore, but it felt like proof that he had existed before the system found him. As Margaret showed him around the building, pointing out maintenance issues that needed attention, David found himself studying her profile. In the fluorescent office lighting, the resemblance was even more striking. They had the same stubborn chin, the same way of tilting their heads when concentrating. "Margaret," he said as they stood in the basement near the building's electrical panel, "do you remember anything about our parents? Their names, what they looked like?" Margaret paused, her hand on the fuse box. "I remember feeling safe. And I remember someone reading to us bedtime stories about children who went on adventures, but always came home." She turned to face him. "Why?" David pulled up his sleeve, revealing the hospital bracelet. "I've worn this since I was a kid. The writing is too faded to read now, but I always hoped it might have information about our family." Margaret examined the bracelet carefully, then pulled out her phone's flashlight. Under the bright LED, she could make out partial letters. DAV. COT. Emergency contact. David Chen. Emergency contact something. She read aloud. "Your parents must have listed someone as an emergency contact. Can you make out the rest?" Margaret squinted at the faded text. It might say Margaret. David Chen. Emergency contact. Margaret. She looked up at him, wonder in her eyes. "They listed me as your emergency contact. Even at 7 years old, I was the person they wanted called if something happened to you." David felt his chest tighten with emotion. We were each other's people, even then. "We still are," Margaret said simply. The rest of the morning passed quietly. David threw himself into his work with an enthusiasm that surprised him. He fixed a broken sink in the third-floor break room, replaced burnt-out bulbs in the parking garage, and repaired a squeaky door that had been annoying tenants for months. Physical work felt good after months of idleness, and having a purpose again was better than any medication. Margaret found herself checking on him throughout the day, not because she doubted his competence, but because she couldn't quite believe he was real. Every time she saw him in the hallway or heard him humming while he worked, she felt a small jolt of recognition and relief. Around noon, Janet approached Margaret's office with a concerned expression. "Miss Chen, I don't mean to pry, but some of the employees are asking questions about David. They're wondering if he's related to you." Margaret had been preparing for this conversation. "What kind of questions?" "Well, he has your last name, and you seem to have taken a very personal interest in his situation. Is he family?" Margaret considered her options. She could lie, say he was just someone she was helping. She could claim it was a company diversity initiative. But looking at Janet's kind face, she found herself telling the truth. "I think he might be my brother," she said quietly. "We were separated as children, and we just found each other yesterday." Janet's eyes widened. "Yesterday? You mean when you went to lunch at that café?" "He asked me for food, and something about him seemed familiar. We started talking, and—" Margaret spread her hands helplessly. "Janet, I know how this sounds." "It sounds like a miracle," Janet said softly. "In 30 years of working with people, I've never seen you look at anyone the way you look at him. Like you're afraid he might disappear." I am afraid he might disappear. Margaret admitted. I'm afraid I might wake up and discover I imagined all of this because I wanted family so badly. He's not going anywhere, Miss Chen. Anyone can see how much this means to both of you. That afternoon, Margaret found David in the building's small garden, where he was repairing an irrigation system that had been broken for months. He'd removed his shirt in the warm sun, and Margaret could see other scars on his back, evidence of a hard life without anyone to watch out for him. How's the apartment? She asked, settling onto a nearby bench. Perfect. Mrs. Liu made me soup and told me I look like her grandson. David sat back on his heels, wiping sweat from his forehead. Margaret, can I ask you something personal? Everything about this situation is personal. Why didn't you ever get married? Have a family of your own? Margaret was quiet for a long moment, considering how to answer. I think I was waiting, she said finally. I told myself I was too focused on my career, too independent to need anyone. But maybe I was just waiting for someone who would stay, someone who wouldn't leave me behind. I would never leave you behind, David said, and the simple certainty in his voice made her eyes well up with tears she hadn't expected. I know that now, but I didn't know it yesterday. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun filter through the trees that Margaret had never really noticed before. Everything felt different. Now colors seemed brighter, sounds seemed clearer, even the air seemed easier to breathe. David, Margaret said eventually, I want to hire a private investigator. Someone who can help us find out more about our parents, about what happened to us. Would that be okay with you? More than okay. I've always wanted to know where I came from. He looked at her seriously. But Margaret, promise me something. Whatever we find out, whether our parents were good people or bad people, whether they would have been proud of us or disappointed, promise me it won't change this. What we've found with each other. Margaret felt her heart expand in a way she'd forgotten was possible. I promise, she said. David, you're stuck with me now. Whether you like it or not, you have a sister who's not going anywhere. As they walked back into the building together, Margaret realized that for the first time in her adult life, she was looking forward to tomorrow. Not because of a business deal or a financial goal, but because tomorrow meant another day of learning how to be someone's sister, another day of watching David remember what it meant to belong somewhere, the scared, lonely child inside her, the one who had spent 30 years pretending she didn't exist, was finally quiet. She was home. 2 weeks into David's employment, Margaret found herself lingering in the building's common areas, hoping to catch glimpses of her brother at work. She watched him interact with other employees, his gentle demeanor with the elderly accountant who needed help reaching files, his patient explanations to the young intern who kept setting off the smoke alarm with her lunch experiments. It was during one such observation that Margaret noticed something that made her heart skip. David was helping Mrs. Peterson from the law firm move a heavy box, and as he lifted it, something fell from his pocket, a small crumpled piece of paper that he quickly retrieved. But not before Margaret caught sight of what looked like a child's drawing. That evening, as they shared dinner at a small restaurant near David's apartment, Margaret finally asked about it. David, I saw you drop something today. It looked like a drawing. David's face reddened slightly. You're very observant. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a piece of paper so worn it was almost transparent. I found this in my things when I was moving into the apartment. I guess I've been carrying it around without realizing. He unfolded it carefully, revealing a child's crayon drawing of 2 stick figures holding hands. In shaky letters at the bottom, someone had written, "Me and Maggie." Margaret stared at the drawing, her breath catching. You drew this? I think so. I remember making pictures when I was little, usually when I was sad or scared. The foster families didn't always understand why I drew the same 2 people over and over. David traced the figures with his finger. I told them it was my imaginary friend, but she felt real to me. She was real, Margaret whispered. David, she was me. Margaret pulled out her phone and scrolled through her photos until she found what she was looking for. I took this picture last week when I was cleaning out my apartment. The image showed a similar child's drawing, though this one was in different colors, and showed the two figures under what might have been a rainbow. At the bottom, in equally shaky letters, was written, Davy and me. David took her phone, comparing the two drawings. The style was unmistakably similar, the same way of drawing faces with dots for eyes and curved lines for smiles, the same proportion of heads to bodies that only a small child would consider accurate. We were drawing each other, he said wonderingly. All those years apart, we were both drawing pictures of each other. It means we never really forgot, Margaret sighed. Even when our conscious minds couldn't remember, some part of us was still connected. They spent the rest of dinner sharing more recovered memories. David remembered always feeling like someone was missing from every family photo, every birthday celebration. Margaret talked about her recurring dream of teaching someone to ride a bicycle, someone shorter than her, someone who trusted her completely to keep them safe. I used to think it was just wish fulfillment, she said. The dream of being needed by someone who wouldn't leave. You taught me to ride a bike, David said suddenly. I remember now. You held onto the back of the seat and ran behind me until I could balance on my own. When I turned around to thank you, you were so far behind me, but you were clapping and cheering. Margaret felt tears gathering. You rode straight into Mrs. Henderson's flower bed. You helped me pick all the petals out of my hair, David continued, the memory becoming clearer. And you told me that falling down was part of learning to get back up. As they walked back to David's apartment, Margaret made a decision. I want to show you something. Would you come to my place tomorrow evening? I think I have more things that might help us remember. The next evening, David stood in Margaret's penthouse apartment, overwhelmed by its size and elegance. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of Seattle's skyline, and every piece of furniture looked like it belonged in a magazine. This is how you live, he asked, not with envy but with wonder. This is how I've been hiding, Margaret corrected. 40 floors up, where no one can reach me. She led him to her home office, where she'd spent the day going through boxes she hadn't opened in years. I found these when I was packing to move here 5 years ago. I could never explain why I kept them. The first box contained school papers and report cards from various foster homes, but buried beneath them were more drawings, all featuring the same two children. There were crayon portraits labeled "My Family," construction paper houses with two figures waving from windows, and finger-painted handprints side by side. The second box held clothing, a small sweater that might have belonged to either of them, a pair of children's mittens connected by a string, and at the very bottom, a sock. Just one sock, tiny and blue with a pattern of trucks on it. David picked up the sock, and his hands began to tremble. I had socks like this, he said quietly. I remember losing one and being so upset that the social worker thought I was having a breakdown. They couldn't understand why a 7-year-old would cry for hours over a missing sock. Because it wasn't just a sock, Margaret said softly. It was proof that someone had chosen it for you. Someone had cared enough to buy you socks with little trucks because they knew you loved trucks. David sat down heavily in Margaret's desk chair, still holding the sock. Our parents bought us matching socks. And somehow, 30 years later, I still have the one you lost. Margaret pulled out the final item from the box, a manila envelope marked "Personal Effects" in official handwriting. Inside were 2 items that made both siblings gasp: their birth certificates and a family photograph they'd never seen before. The photograph showed their parents clearly for the first time. Their father was a tall man with David's eyes and gentle smile. Their mother was petite like Margaret, with the same determined chin and expressive hands. Between them stood two children, maybe 6 and 7 years old, grinning at the camera, with gap-toothed smiles. They looked happy, David observed. We all looked happy. Margaret studied her parents' faces, searching for clues about who they'd been, what kind of people had created the two children in the photo. Thomas and Linda Chen. She read from the birth certificates. Our father was a carpenter. Our mother worked at a preschool. Working-class people, David said. People who worked with their hands, who took care of children. That explains why I've always been good at fixing things. Why you ended up in social work first. We got their best qualities, Margaret agreed. Dad's skill with building and creating. Mom's instinct for taking care of people. They spent the next hour reconstructing their family history from the few documents Margaret had preserved. Their parents had been young when they died, only 32 and 28. They'd owned a small house in West Seattle, had been married for 9 years, and according to a letter from their father's employer, were devoted parents who brought their children to every company picnic. They loved us, Margaret said, as if the realization surprised her. All these years, I wondered if we'd been given up because we were unwanted. But they loved us. And they died in a car accident that wasn't their fault, David added, reading from an old newspaper clipping. Drunk driver ran a red light. Dad died instantly. Mom lived long enough to tell the paramedics to take care of her babies. They sat in silence for a while, mourning parents they barely remembered and a childhood that had been stolen from them. But there was comfort in the mourning now, because they were doing it together. David, Margaret said eventually, I want to ask you something, but I don't want you to feel pressured. Ask me anything. Would you consider letting me help you in other ways? Not just the job in the apartment, but she gestured around the enormous penthouse. I have more money than I could spend in 10 lifetimes. I could set up a trust fund. Make sure you never have to worry about security again. David was quiet for a long moment, and Margaret worried she'd offended him. Finally, he spoke. Can I tell you something that might sound strange? After everything that's happened this week, nothing sounds strange anymore. I don't want your money, David said gently. Not because I'm proud, and not because I don't appreciate the offer, but because having you back is worth more than any amount of money. For the first time in 30 years, I'm not alone. That's the only security I need. Margaret felt her eyes fill with tears. You're sure? I'm sure. But there is something I'd like, if you're willing. Anything. David smiled, and Margaret realized it was the first completely unguarded expression she'd seen from him. I'd like to spend more time learning how to be your brother. I'd like to hear all your stories, the good ones and the bad ones. I'd like to know what made you laugh when you were 20, what made you cry when you were 30. I'd like to know my sister. You'd like to be a family, Margaret said, understanding completely. I'd like to be a family, David confirmed. The family we were supposed to be all along. As David prepared to leave that evening, Margaret walked into the door. On impulse, she reached up and hugged him. The first time she'd initiated physical contact with another person in years. David hugged her back, and for a moment, Margaret felt like the little girl in the photograph, safe and loved and exactly where she belonged. Margaret, David said as he stepped into the hallway, thank you for not walking past me that day. Thank you for seeing me. Thank you for asking the right question, Margaret replied. Thank you for being brave enough to ask a stranger for help. After he left, Margaret stood at her window looking out at the city lights. But for the first time, she wasn't looking down at the world from her tower. She was looking across at it, seeing it as a place where miracles could happen, where families could find each other against impossible odds, where a simple question about leftovers could change everything. In his apartment 20 blocks away, David was looking out his own window at the same city, holding the blue sock with the little trucks and marveling at the strange way life could circle back on itself. Tomorrow, he would wake up and go to work in his sister's building. Tomorrow, he would have someone to eat lunch with, someone to call if he needed help, someone who knew his real name and his real story. Tomorrow, for the first time in 30 years, he would wake up as somebody's brother. 3 weeks later, Margaret found herself doing something she hadn't done in over a decade, inviting someone to her home for dinner. She'd spent the afternoon cooking, following recipes she'd found online and calling David twice to ask if he preferred his vegetables steamed or roasted. "You're cooking?" David had laughed. "Margaret, you don't have to go to all this trouble." "I want to," she'd insisted, and realized she meant it. She wanted to take care of someone, wanted to create the kind of warm, welcoming space she'd dreamed about as a child. When David arrived, carrying a small potted plant as a housewarming gift, Margaret was struck by how much he'd changed in just a few weeks. The hollow-cheeked man who'd asked for her leftovers had been replaced by someone who stood straighter, smiled easier, and moved through the world like he had a right to take up space in it. "You look different," she told him as she took his jacket. "I feel different. I feel like myself again, if that makes sense." David looked around the apartment, noting the changes Margaret had made since his last visit. The stock hotel-like perfection had been softened with photographs, books, and small personal touches that made the space feel lived in. During dinner, Margaret brought up something that had been weighing on her mind. "David, I've been thinking about our conversation the other night, about wanting to know each other's stories. There's something I should tell you about why I really left social work." David set down his fork, giving her his full attention. "You don't have to tell me anything you're not ready to share. I want to tell you. I think you'll understand better than anyone else would." Margaret took a deep breath. "I left social work because I couldn't save a family. 2 siblings, about the same age we would have been when we were separated. Their parents died, and I was supposed to keep them together, find them a home where they could stay brothers. But there weren't any families willing to take both children, and my supervisor said it was better for them to be placed separately than to wait indefinitely. What happened to them? I placed them in different homes, telling myself it was temporary. The older boy, Marcus, was 8. He kept asking me when he could see his little brother again. I kept promising him it would be soon." Margaret's voice grew quiet. 6 months later, Marcus ran away from his foster home. They found him trying to walk to his brother's placement, which was 40 miles away. He'd been walking for 2 days. David reached across the table and took her hand. "Margaret, they never found another placement for them together. Marcus aged out of the system and disappeared. His brother was adopted by a family that moved to another state and changed his name. They never saw each other again." Margaret wiped her eyes with her free hand. "I became a businesswoman because I thought if I had enough money, enough power, I could fix things that social workers couldn't fix. But really, I think I just couldn't bear to see any more families broken apart. Is that why you've been so determined to help me? Because you couldn't help them? Maybe partly, but mostly because you're my brother, and I spent 30 years not knowing where you were. I know what it feels like to be Marcus, walking 40 miles to find the person who matters most." David was quiet for a long moment, processing what she'd shared. "Margaret, can I show you something?" He reached into his shirt and pulled out a chain Margaret hadn't noticed before. Hanging from it was half of a heart-shaped pendant, tarnished with age. "I've worn this since I was a child. The foster families always thought it was strange that I wouldn't take it off, but I couldn't explain why it was important." Margaret's eyes widened. She stood up and walked to her bedroom, returning with a small jewelry box. Inside, nestled in faded velvet, was the other half of the heart. When she held it next to David's pendant, the jagged edges aligned perfectly. "Best friends forever," David read from the complete pendant. "But that's not right. We weren't best friends. We were brother and sister," Margaret finished. "Even better than best friends." They sat on Margaret's couch, the reconstructed pendant between them on the coffee table. It seemed incredible that they'd both preserved their halves for 30 years, never knowing what they were saving them for. "David," Margaret said eventually, "I need to ask you something, and I want you to be honest with me. Always. Are you happy? I mean, really happy? Not just grateful or relieved, but actually happy with the life you're building?" David considered the question seriously. "I'm happier than I've been in decades. Why do you ask?" "Because I worry that I'm overwhelming you. That I'm trying to give you too much too fast. Because I'm trying to make up for 30 years in 30 days. Margaret turned to face him fully. "I don't want to be another person in your life who makes decisions for you without asking what you actually want." "What I want," David said slowly, "is exactly what I have. A job that uses my skills, a home that's mine, and a sister who cares enough to worry about overwhelming me." He smiled. "Margaret, you're not overwhelming me. You're just loving me, and I'm still learning how to receive that." "I'm still learning how to give it," Margaret admitted. "I spent so many years building walls that I'm not sure I remember how to be open with people." "We'll figure it out together," David said. "That's what families do, right? They figure things out together." That night, after David had gone home, Margaret found herself looking through more old photographs. She'd discovered a box of pictures in her closet that she'd never fully examined, and now she spread them across her dining room table like pieces of a puzzle. There were school photos from various foster homes, birthday parties where she'd been the only child without family in attendance, graduation ceremonies where she'd sat alone in the audience afterward. But in every photo, even the happy ones, there was something missing in her expression, a kind of searching look, as if she was always scanning the crowd for someone who wasn't there. She called David, even though it was nearly midnight. "Margaret, is everything okay? I'm sorry to call so late. I just wanted to hear your voice." She felt foolish saying it, but it was true. "You can call me any time. That's what brothers are for." "David, can I ask you something? In all those years when you were moving from place to place, from job to job, were you looking for something? Or someone?" David was quiet for a moment. "I think I was looking for home. Not a place, but a feeling. The feeling that I belonged somewhere, that someone would notice if I disappeared." "I was looking for the same thing," Margaret said. "I thought I could create that feeling with success, with money, with achievement. But it never worked. The feeling I was looking for was you." "The feeling I was looking for was you too," David replied. "I just didn't know how to name it." After they hung up, Margaret gathered all the photographs and put them away except for one, a picture from her college graduation where she was standing alone in her cap and gown, but smiling genuinely for the first time in any of the photos. She'd been thinking about her future that day, about the social work career she was planning, about the families she would help keep together. She hadn't known then that she was planning to spend her career looking for herself. Now, finally, she'd been found. And tomorrow, she would wake up as somebody's sister, somebody's family, somebody's home. The searching look in her eyes was gone forever, replaced by the peaceful expression of someone who finally knew where she belonged. A month into their newfound relationship, Margaret made a decision that would have been unthinkable 6 weeks earlier. She hired a private investigator, not just to research their past, but to understand how they'd lost each other and whether there were any other family members they didn't know about. The investigator, Elena Vasquez, was a former social worker herself, who specialized in reuniting families separated by the foster care system. She met with Margaret and David in Margaret's office on a rainy Thursday afternoon, spreading documents across the conference table like evidence in a case that had been cold for 30 years. "I want to prepare you both," Elena began. "What I found is both heartbreaking and unfortunately typical for children who entered the system in the 1990s. The good news is that there's a clear paper trail. The challenging news is that there were several missed opportunities to keep you together. She pulled out the first document, the original police report from the accident. Your parents were killed instantly when a drunk driver ran a red light at the intersection of California and Admiral. You were both in the back seat, properly secured in car seats, which saved your lives. David suffered a concussion and the facial laceration that left a scar above his eyebrow. Margaret had minor injuries, but was treated for severe emotional trauma. David unconsciously touched his scar. I remember being in the hospital, but everything is so hazy. That's normal for head trauma combined with psychological shock, Elena explained. According to the medical records, you kept asking for your sister, but the hospital staff assumed you were confused to the concussion. What about me? Margaret asked. Do the records say anything about what I was doing? Elena's expression softened. You refused to speak for the first 3 weeks. After the accident, the only thing you would say was, "Where's Davy?" The social workers thought you were referring to an imaginary friend. Margaret felt her chest tighten. Even at 7 years old, she'd been looking for her brother. Here's where the system failed you, Elena continued, pulling out more paperwork. Your parents had no living relatives, but they'd named guardians in their will. Your father's best friend and his wife, Jim and Sarah Thompson. The Thompsons were contacted and expressed immediate interest in taking both children. Then, why didn't they? David asked. Because the Thompsons lived in Portland, and the state of Washington required a 6-month residency period before out-of-state adoptions could be finalized. During those 6 months, you were supposed to be placed in temporary foster care together. Elena's voice grew grim, but there was a miscommunication between departments. Margaret was placed with the Hendersons in Ballard, and David was sent to the Johnsons in Tacoma. We were in different cities, Margaret said numbly. For 6 months, we were only 40 miles apart, and nobody told us. It gets worse, Elena said gently. After 3 months, the Thompsons' situation changed. Jim was diagnosed with cancer, and they had to withdraw their petition. But by then, you'd both been placed in what the system considered stable foster situations, and the caseworkers decided it would be too disruptive to reunite you. David stood up and walked to the window, his hands clenched into fists. They had a choice. Someone made a choice to keep us apart. Multiple people made that choice, repeatedly, over the course of several years, Elena confirmed. I found that. At least 4 different occasions when caseworkers recommended reunification, but were overruled by supervisors who felt you were both adjusting well to your separate placements. Margaret stared at the documents, trying to process the magnitude of what they'd lost. What happened to the Thompsons? Are they still alive? Jim Thompson died in 1998, but Sarah is still living in Portland. She's 84 now, but sharp as a tack. I spoke with her yesterday. Elena pulled out a handwritten letter. She asked me to give you this. Margaret took the letter with trembling hands and read it aloud. Dear Margaret and David, I have thought about you both every day for 30 years. Jim and I wanted so desperately to take you home with us, to raise you as the family your parents intended. When we had to withdraw our petition, we begged the state to keep you together until another family could be found. We were told that children are resilient and that you would both be fine. We knew that was wrong, but we had no legal standing to fight for you. I kept your parents' photo albums and personal belongings, hoping that someday you would come, looking for your history. If you would like to visit, or if you would prefer that I send everything to you, please let me know. Your parents loved you both so much, and they would be proud of the people you've become. With love and 30 years of prayers, Sarah Thompson. Both Margaret and David were crying now. They'd spent their entire adult lives believing they were alone in the world, when there had been someone who remembered them, who had kept pieces of their family story safe. There's more, Elena said softly. Sarah kept everything photo albums, your parents' wedding video, birthday cards they'd written for future birthdays they didn't live to see. She also kept the original copies of the drawings you made for each other. Apparently, during the brief time you were both in temporary care, you drew pictures for each other constantly, and the social workers would deliver them back and forth. We were drawing letters, Margaret realized. We were trying to stay connected the only way we knew how. Elena nodded. Children are remarkably resourceful when it comes to love. Even when the adults around them fail, they find ways to maintain their bonds. David returned to his chair, wiping his eyes. I want to meet her. Sarah Thompson. I want to thank her for remembering us. I want to see the photos, Margaret added. I want to know what our parents were like when they weren't just names on documents. I can arrange both of those things, Elena said. Sarah would love to meet you. And there's something else. She's been in touch with several of your parents. Friends over the years. There are people who knew your family, who have stories to share if you're interested. As Elena packed up her documents, she pulled out one final item, a small wooden box. This was your father's. Sarah thought you should have it. Inside the box were two items, a wedding ring engraved with Thomas and Linda forever, and a small notebook filled with Thomas Chen's handwriting. Margaret opened to a random page and read, Davy learned to tie his shoes today. Maggie was so proud she made him demonstrate for everyone at the grocery store. She told the cashier, my brother is very smart and also very brave. She's going to be a wonderful big sister when the new baby comes. We decided not to tell the children about the pregnancy until Linda is further along, but I can't wait to see them as big brother and big sister to someone else. Margaret looked up at David, her eyes wide. We were going to have another sibling. Elena checked her notes. Linda was 8 weeks pregnant when the accident happened. I'm sorry, I should have mentioned that earlier. They sat in silence for a while, mourning not just their parents and their lost childhood, but the brother or sister who had never had a chance to be born, who would have made them a family of 5 instead of 2 survivors clinging to fragments of memory. Elena, Margaret said finally, how many other families are there like ours? How many siblings are out there, separated and not knowing about each other? More than you'd want to believe. The system has improved significantly since the 1990s, but it still happens. Families still get broken apart by bureaucracy, by miscommunication, by caseworkers who think they know what's best. Margaret looked at David, and he nodded, understanding what she was thinking without needing to hear the words. What would it take, Margaret asked, to start a foundation that helps reunite separated families? Something with enough resources to hire investigators like you, to pay for DNA testing, to cover travel costs for reunions? Elena's face lit up. It would take exactly what you two have: money, determination, and the understanding of what it means to lose family. Are you serious about this? We're serious, David said. Our parents died wanting us to stay together. We can't change what happened to us, but maybe we can change what happens to other families. As Elena left, promising to arrange the meeting with Sarah Thompson, Margaret and David remained in the conference room, surrounded by the documents that told the story of how their family had been broken and how it was finally being healed. Are you ready for this? Margaret asked. Meeting Sarah, learning more about our parents, starting a foundation? I'm ready for all of it, David said. For the first time in my life, I'm ready for everything, because I'm not facing it alone. Outside, the rain had stopped, an afternoon. Sunlight was breaking through the clouds, casting long shadows across the city, where 2 siblings had spent 30 years unknowingly searching for each other. Tomorrow, they would begin the work of ensuring that other families wouldn't have to search as long as they had. The DNA test results arrived on a Tuesday morning in November, exactly 2 months after David had asked Margaret for her leftovers. Margaret held the sealed envelope, her hands trembling slightly despite knowing what it would say. Do you want to open it together? David asked. They were standing in Margaret's office, morning coffee growing cold on her desk. I know what it's going to say, Margaret replied. But yes, I want us to open it together. She tore open the envelope and pulled out the official document. At the top, in bold letters, it read, Probability of full sibling relationship, 99.97%. David let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. 99.97%. The other 0.03% accounts for statistical margin of error, Margaret said, though her voice was thick with emotion. David, we're officially siblings. They stood there for a moment, holding the paper that confirmed what their hearts had known from the beginning. It should have felt anticlimactic, after all. They'd already been living as brother and sister for weeks. But seeing it in black and white stamped with official seals felt like the final piece of a puzzle falling into place. There's something else, David said. Elena called this morning. She's arranged our meeting with Sarah Thompson for this weekend. She's also sent us something photos of our parents that Sarah kept. Margaret's assistant had forwarded a package that morning, and now Margaret opened it with careful hands. Inside were dozens of photographs they'd never seen. Their parents on their wedding day, looking impossibly young and happy. Family vacations to beaches Margaret could almost remember. Birthday parties where 7-year-old Margaret and 6-year-old David grinned at the camera with chocolate. Cake smeared on their faces, but it was the last photo in the stack that took both their breaths away. It showed their parents reading bedtime stories, with Margaret curled up against her mother's side and David sprawled across his father's lap. Everyone was in pajamas, and the scene was so perfectly domestic, so full of love and security, that it hurt to look at. We were happy, David said softly. Before everything went wrong, we were really, truly happy. And we can be happy again, Margaret replied. Different happiness, but real happiness. That afternoon brought an unexpected visitor. Janet knocked on Margaret's office door, looking flustered. Miss Chen, there's a reporter here from the Seattle Times. She says she's heard about your story about you and David finding each other and she'd like to do an interview. Margaret and David exchanged glances. They'd been so focused on their private reunion that they hadn't considered public interest in their story. Should we talk to her? David asked. Margaret considered. What if we do? What if we tell our story publicly? It might help other separated families realize they have options, that there are people working to reunite them. The reporter, Jessica Martinez, was a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a gentle manner that put both siblings at ease. She listened to their story without interruption, occasionally asking for clarification, but never pushing for details they weren't comfortable sharing. This is remarkable, she said when they finished. In 20 years of journalism, I've never heard anything quite like this. Would you be willing to let me write about your story? And about the foundation you're planning to start? What would? You want to know? Margaret asked. I'd want to focus on the hope, Jessica said. There are so many stories about families being broken apart, but very few about families finding each other again. Your story could give people something to believe in. David nodded slowly. If it helps even one family avoid what we went through, then yes, we should tell our story. The interview took 2 hours. Jessica asked about their childhoods in foster care, their struggles as adults, the moment they met at the café, and their plans for the Chen Family Foundation. She was respectful of their emotions, giving them time to compose themselves when the memories became overwhelming. One last question, Jessica said as she packed up her recording equipment. What would you say to other people who might be out there, separated from siblings they don't remember? Margaret and David looked at each other, and David answered first. I'd say don't give up hope. I spent 30 years thinking I was completely alone, but I wasn't. Somewhere in this city, my sister was thinking about me too, even when she didn't know my name. And I'd say that sometimes the people we're looking for are closer than we think, Margaret added. Sometimes they're the homeless person we walk past on the street, or the coworker we barely notice. Sometimes family finds us when we least expect it and most need it. A week later, the article appeared on the front page of the Seattle Times Sunday edition. The headline read, "From Strangers to Siblings, a Seattle Miracle 30 Years in the Making." The article was accompanied by 2 photos, one showing Margaret and David as children, playing in their parents' backyard, and another showing them as adults, standing together outside Café Luna, where they'd first met. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Margaret's office was flooded with calls from people who'd read the story and wanted to help with the foundation. David's phone rang constantly with messages from other adoptees and foster children who'd lost touch with their siblings. Elena Vasquez called to say she'd received over 100 inquiries about family reunification services. But the most significant call came from Sarah Thompson. "Margaret? David? This is Sarah. I just read the article, and I'm so proud of you both. Your parents would be over the moon to see what you've accomplished and how you've found each other again." They arranged to visit Sarah that weekend in Portland. The drive south was quiet. Both siblings lost in thought about meeting someone who had known their parents as people rather than names on documents. Sarah Thompson lived in a modest ranch house with a garden that showed decades of loving care. She met them at the door with tears in her eyes and arms open for hugs from the children she'd wanted to raise 30 years earlier. "Let me look at you," she said, stepping back to study their faces. "You have your father's eyes, David, and Margaret, you have your mother's smile. Come in, come in. I have so much to show you." Sarah's living room had been transformed into a shrine to their family's memory. Photo albums covered every surface, along with items she'd saved: their father's toolbox, their mother's jewelry, report cards from their early elementary school years, and dozens of drawings they'd made for their parents. "Your mother kept everything," Sarah explained. "Every drawing, every school project, every little note you wrote her. She said that someday, when you were grown up, you'd want to remember being children." She was right. Margaret and David spent hours going through their childhood artifacts, remembering who they'd been before tragedy changed everything. They found drawings of their family as superheroes, with their parents flying through the sky and their children following behind with capes streaming. They found Mother's Day cards they'd made, decorated with glitter and childish promises to be good forever. But the most precious discovery was a videotape labeled Christmas 1993, the last Christmas their family had spent together. Sarah put it in her old VCR, and suddenly their parents were alive again, moving and talking and laughing with their children. On the fuzzy screen, 7-year-old Margaret was helping 6-year-old David open a present, a set of matching toy cars. Their father was behind the camera, asking them what they wanted to do with their new cars. "We're going to drive to the moon," little David announced. "Can I come too?" Their father's voice asked from behind the camera. "Yes, but you have to hold Maggie's hand so she won't be scared," David replied seriously. "I'm not scared when Davy's with me," little Margaret added, wrapping her arm around her brother's shoulders. Their mother's voice came from off-camera. "That's what families do. They keep each other safe and brave." Margaret and David watched, their younger selves marveling at how close they'd been, how natural their bond had seemed. Even at 6 and 7, they'd been each other's protection against a world that seemed too big and uncertain. "They knew," Sarah said softly. "Your parents knew how much you loved each other. The last thing your mother said to me before the accident was that she hoped you two would always take care of each other, no matter what happened." "We did," David said, his voice choked with emotion. "Even when we didn't know we were doing it, we were taking care of each other. I was keeping her memory safe, and she was keeping mine safe." "And now you're together again," Sarah said, ready to take care of each other for real. As they prepared to leave that evening, Sarah gave them one final gift, their parents' wedding. Rings and a letter their father had written to them when they were babies, sealed in an envelope marked for Margaret and David when they're old enough to understand. They waited until they were back in Seattle to open the letter, reading it together in Margaret's apartment. My dearest children, if you're reading this, it means something has happened to your mother and me. We hope you're together, taking care of each other the way you always have. We want you to know that you were the greatest joy of our lives, and that every day with you was a gift we never took for granted. Be kind to each other. Be patient with each other. Remember that family isn't just about blood. It's about choosing to love someone every day, even when it's hard. We will always be with you, in your hearts and in the love you show each other. Love always, Dad. They held each other and cried for the parents they'd lost, for the childhood that had been stolen from them, and for the 30 years they'd spent apart. But they also cried with gratitude for finding each other, for the people who had helped them along the way, and for the future they were building together. The next morning, Margaret called Elena Vasquez. We're ready to make the foundation official. How soon can we start helping other families? How does next week sound? Elena replied. I already have 3 cases that could use your help. Margaret looked at David, who was reading their father's letter again, his face peaceful in a way she'd never seen before. Next week sounds perfect, she said. We're ready to help other people find their way home. The article in the Seattle Times had consequences neither Margaret nor David had anticipated. Within days of its publication, Margaret's office became an unofficial headquarters for separated families across the Pacific Northwest. People drove from as far away as Vancouver and Portland, carrying faded photographs and half-remembered stories, hoping that the siblings who had found each other could help them do the same. Elena Vasquez moved into a temporary office in Margaret's building, and Margaret hired 2 additional investigators to handle the growing caseload. But it was David who proved to have an unexpected gift for this work. Having lived through homelessness and disconnection himself, he could speak to people in ways that Margaret and the professional investigators couldn't. You don't have to prove you deserve to find your family, he told a young woman named Carmen, who'd been separated from her 3 brothers when she was 12. You don't have to earn the right to love and be loved. Family isn't something you have to qualify for. Carmen had been living in her car for 2 weeks, having driven up from California with nothing but a social security number she thought might belong to one of her brothers. She'd been turned away from 3 different agencies who told her she didn't have enough information to justify a search. Margaret watched David work with Carmen, noting how he never talked down to her, never made her feel like her situation was hopeless. When Carmen broke down crying, explaining that she'd been told by social workers that her brothers had probably forgotten about her anyway, David sat quietly until she finished, then said simply, I can promise you they haven't forgotten. Love doesn't work that way. By December, the informal network had grown into something that needed structure and legal recognition. Margaret scheduled a meeting with her lawyer to establish the Chen Family Foundation officially. But as the date approached, she found herself increasingly nervous about something she couldn't name. David, she said one evening as they shared dinner at his apartment, are you happy with how fast everything is moving? The foundation, the publicity, all these people depending on us. David set down his fork and looked at her carefully. What are you really asking me? I'm asking if you feel like your life has been taken over by our story. 6 months ago, you were living your own life, making your own choices. Now, everywhere you go, you're Margaret Chen's brother, the miracle reunion, the poster child for family reunification. And you're worried that I resent it, David said, understanding immediately. Margaret, do you remember what I told you the first night we had dinner? That I didn't want your money, but I wanted to learn how to be your brother? Yes, This is how I learned to be your brother. By working alongside you, by helping other people. Find what we found. I'm not Margaret Chen's brother because of some accident. I'm Margaret Chen's brother because I choose to be. Every day, Margaret felt some of the tension leave her shoulders. I just don't want you to feel like you have to do this work because I'm passionate about it. I am passionate about it, David said firmly. Carmen found her oldest brother yesterday because of the work we're doing. He's been looking for her for 15 years. Do you know what he said when Elena called him? Margaret shook her head. He said, I knew she was alive. I could feel it in my heart that she was still out there. That's exactly what I felt about you, Margaret. For 30 years, I felt like someone was missing, and I couldn't name what it was. Now I get to help other people stop feeling that way. The formal launch of the Chen Family Foundation took place on a snowy January morning, exactly 4 months after Margaret and David had met outside Café Luna. The venue was the ballroom of a downtown hotel filled with social workers, family lawyers, representatives from adoption agencies, and dozens of families who had been reunited through their early efforts. Margaret stood at the podium, looking out at the audience, and for the first time in her professional life, she wasn't thinking about business strategy or profit margins. She was thinking about David, who sat in the front row wearing the suit she bought him, grinning at her with the same gap-toothed smile from their childhood photos. 6 months ago, Margaret began, I was a successful businesswoman who had convinced herself that she didn't need family. I had money, power, and professional respect. But I went home every night to an empty apartment and wondered why nothing I achieved felt quite complete. She paused, looking directly at David. Then a homeless man asked me for my leftovers, and everything changed. Not because of what I gave him, but because of what he gave me, the chance to remember who I was before I became who I thought I needed to be. The audience was completely quiet, hanging on every word. Margaret had become a gifted public speaker through years of business presentations, but this was different. This was personal truth, shared without armor or pretense. David and I learned that we had been separated not by choice, but by a system that made decisions about our lives without considering what we needed most each other. We were lucky enough to find each other again, but we know that luck isn't enough. There are thousands of families out there, broken apart by circumstances beyond their control, who deserve better than luck. Margaret went on to outline the Foundation's mission, providing free investigation services for family reunification, covering travel costs for reunions, offering counseling for families learning to rebuild relationships after years of separation, and advocating for policy changes to keep families together whenever possible. When she finished speaking, the applause was sustained and heartfelt. But it was David's reaction that mattered most to her. He was wiping tears from his eyes, and when she stepped down from the podium, he stood to hug her. I'm proud of you, he whispered in her ear. I'm proud to be your brother. After the formal presentations, people mingled over coffee and pastries, sharing their own stories of separation and reunion. Margaret found herself talking with an elderly man named Robert, who'd been searching for his twin sister for 60 years. We were separated during World War II, he explained. Our parents sent us to different relatives for safety, thinking it would be temporary. But our parents were killed in the bombing of London, and somehow the relatives never contacted each other. I've been looking for Mary ever since. Have you tried DNA testing? Margaret asked. I wouldn't know how to begin. I'm not very good with technology, and most of the agencies I've contacted say that 60 years is too long, that the trail has gone cold. Margaret looked across the room at Elena, who was helping Carmen fill out paperwork for her brother's search. Robert, would you mind if I introduced you to someone who might be able to help? As she watched Elena take Robert's case information with the same careful attention she'd given to every other family, Margaret felt a deep sense of satisfaction. This was what money should do: not buy luxury or status, but create opportunities for healing, for connection, for love to find its way back to where it belonged. David approached, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "How many new cases did we get today?" 17, Margaret replied, "including a set of triplets who were separated at birth and have never met each other. Elena's going to need more help." "I know. I'm thinking of expanding to other cities: Portland, San Francisco, maybe Denver. What do you think?" David considered this. "I think we should be careful not to grow faster than we can handle. Every case is someone's whole life. We can't afford to make mistakes." Margaret nodded, appreciating his wisdom. This was what she'd needed all along in her business: not just someone to agree with her plans, but someone who cared about the same things she cared about and wasn't afraid to question her when questioning was needed. "David," she said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to think about it before you answer." "Okay, how would you feel about becoming co-director of the foundation? Not just helping with cases, but making decisions about how we operate, where we expand, how we use our resources." David was quiet for a long moment, watching the people around them: families who had found each other, families still searching, social workers and investigators who had dedicated their careers to keeping love alive across impossible distances. "I'd feel honored," he said finally. "But Margaret, I need you to understand something. I'm not the same person who asked you for leftovers 6 months ago." That man was broken, defeated, convinced he didn't deserve anything good. The man standing here today is your brother, your partner in this work, someone who knows his own worth. "I know exactly who you are," Margaret replied. "You're the person I've been waiting my whole life to work alongside." As the event wound down and people began to leave, Margaret and David found themselves alone in the ballroom, surrounded by the remnants of their public debut as the Chen Family Foundation. "Are you ready for this?" Margaret asked, gesturing at the materials Elena had left for them: 17 new case files, each representing a family that needed their help. "I've been ready for this my whole life," David replied. "I just didn't know what I was getting ready for." They walked out of the hotel together, brother and sister, business partners, and guardians of other people's hope. Tomorrow, they would begin the work of reuniting 17 more families. Tonight, they would go home to their respective apartments. But for the first time in either of their lives, going home alone didn't feel lonely. They had found their purpose, and their purpose was helping other people find their way back to love. 3 months after the foundation's launch, Margaret received a phone call that would test everything she and David had built together. It was Elena, and her voice carried a tension Margaret had never heard before. "Margaret, we need to talk. In person, and bring David." They met at Elena's office, where she had spread documents across her desk with the same careful precision she used for all her cases. But this time, the documents were about them. "I've been working on Robert's case, the elderly man looking for his twin sister Mary," Elena began. The DNA database search turned up something unexpected. Margaret felt her stomach tighten. What kind of unexpected? A partial match to David's DNA profile. Not close enough to be a sibling, but close enough to suggest you might have extended. "Family you don't know about." David leaned forward in his chair. "What does that mean?" "It means that Mary Morrison, the woman Robert has been searching for, appears to be your cousin. Your father's brother's daughter." The room fell silent except for the sound of traffic outside Elena's window. Margaret stared at the DNA charts, trying to process what she was hearing. "Our father had a brother?" David asked. "According to these results, yes. And if Mary is still alive, she would be your blood relative, the only one either of you has ever known besides each other." Margaret felt as if the ground was shifting beneath her feet again, the same way it had when she first realized David might be her brother. Elena, are you telling us that we have an aunt we've never met? I'm telling you that it's possible. But there's something else, and this is why I needed to see you both together. Elena's expression grew even more serious. Robert Morrison isn't just looking for his twin sister. He's been looking for his family's lost children, too. She pulled out a faded photograph that showed 2 adults and 4 children. This is the Morrison family in 1943, before the war separated them. Robert, his twin sister Mary, and their older siblings Thomas and Patricia. Margaret picked up the photograph, studying the faces. The man labeled as Thomas looked remarkably like their father in the photo Sarah Thompson had shown them. Thomas Morrison, Elena continued, married a woman named Linda Chang in 1960. They changed their last name to Chen when they moved to Seattle in 1962. David's voice was barely a whisper. Thomas Morrison was our father. It appears so. Which means Robert Morrison has been searching for his twin sister for 60 years, not knowing that his nephew's children were searching for family too. Margaret set the photograph down with trembling hands. Where is she? Where is Mary? That's what we need to find out. Robert last saw her in 1943, when she was evacuated to a family in Scotland. After the war, he tried to trace her, but the records were destroyed in the fire. He's been looking ever since. The implications were staggering. Not only did Margaret and David have an uncle they'd never known about, but their search for him might help a 90-year-old man find the sister he'd lost as a child. Does Robert know? David asked. Does he know that we're his nephew's children? Not yet. I wanted to talk to you first, to see how you felt about this information becoming part of his case. Margaret looked at David, seeing her own mixture of excitement and apprehension reflected in his face. They'd spent months helping other families reunite, but they hadn't expected their own family story to continue unfolding. I think we should meet him, David said. I think we should tell him who we are and help him find Mary, our Aunt Mary. Are you sure? Margaret asked. This changes everything about our family history. We're not just 2 orphan siblings anymore. We're part of something bigger. Maybe that's exactly what we need, David replied. Maybe helping Robert find Mary is how we truly honor our parents' memory. That afternoon, they drove to Robert Morrison's modest apartment in Ballard. He answered the door with the same hopeful expression Margaret had seen on the faces of dozens of families who'd come to their foundation. The look of someone who had never stopped believing that love could bridge any distance. Mr. Morrison, Margaret said gently, we have some news about your case, but it's complicated. May we come in? Robert's living room was a testament to 60 years of searching. The walls were covered with maps, photographs, and family trees. A bulletin board held letters from agencies, investigators, and government offices from around the world. In the center of it all was an enlarged photograph of a young girl with dark hair and serious eyes. Mary Morrison, at age 10. The last picture Robert had of his twin sister. She had a laugh that could fill a room, Robert said, following Margaret's gaze to the photograph. Even during the worst of the bombing, when we were all terrified, Mary could find something to laugh about. I've missed that laugh for 60 years. Margaret and David sat on Robert's worn couch, trying to find the right words to explain what Elena had discovered. Mr. Morrison, David began. What Elena found in the DNA database wasn't just information about Mary. She found a connection to Margaret and me. Robert looked confused. A connection? What kind of connection? We believe you're our great-uncle, Margaret said softly. Your brother Thomas was our father. Robert went very still, staring at them as if they were ghosts. Thomas? My brother. Thomas had children? 2 children, David confirmed. Margaret and me. We were separated when our parents died in a car accident 30 years ago, and we just found each other 6 months ago. Robert's eyes filled with tears. Thomas had children, and I never knew. He had children, and they grew up without family, just like Mary and I did. He struggled to his feet and walked to a wooden chest in the corner of the room. Inside were dozens of letters, all addressed to Thomas Morrison at various addresses around Seattle. I wrote to him every year for 20 years, Robert said, his voice breaking. Christmas letters, birthday letters, letters telling him about my life and asking about his. They all came back, address unknown, or recipient moved, no forwarding address. I thought he didn't want to be found. He didn't know you were looking for him, Margaret said gently. He changed his name when he married our mother. He became Thomas Chen, not Thomas Morrison. All this time, Robert whispered, I had a nephew in the same city, and we never found each other. David stood up and put his hand on Robert's shoulder. But we found each other now, and we're going to help you find Mary. We're going to bring this family back together. Robert looked up at him with wonder. You would do that? Even though I'm a stranger to you? You're not a stranger, Margaret said. You're family. And family doesn't give up on each other. Over the next several hours, Robert shared his memories of Thomas, the older brother who had taught him to read, who had protected him from bullies, who had promised to write every day when they were separated during the war, but who had simply vanished into the chaos of post-war displacement. Thomas was the smart one, Robert said. He was going to be an engineer, build bridges and buildings that would last forever. I suppose that's where you get your business sense, he told Margaret, and your skill with tools. He told David Dodd as evening approached. Elena arrived with more information. She'd been working through the international databases, following every lead about Mary Morrison's possible whereabouts. I have good news and challenging news, she announced. The good news is that I found Mary. She's alive, she's healthy, and she's been living in Edinburgh, Scotland for the past 30 years. Robert gripped the arms of his chair. She's alive? My Mary is alive? Yes. The challenging news is that she's been searching for you too, Robert. She's registered with every missing persons database in the UK and several in the United States. She never stopped looking for her twin brother. Margaret felt tears gathering. They've both been searching for 60 years, and neither of them knew the other was still looking. There's more, Elena continued. Mary never married, but she worked as a children's advocate for most of her career. She specialized in helping separated families reunite. She's been doing the same work we do, but from the other side of the Atlantic. David shook his head in amazement. She became a professional family reuniter because she never found her own family. When can I talk to her? Robert asked urgently. Can we call her tonight? Elena smiled. I already took the liberty of reaching out to her through the Edinburgh Missing Persons Registry. She's expecting your call at 9 o'clock tonight, which is 5 in the morning her time. She said she's been waiting 60 years. She doesn't mind getting up early. At exactly 9 o'clock, Margaret, David, Elena, and Robert gathered around Robert's old rotary phone as he dialed the international number Elena had provided. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times, and then a woman's voice answered clear, strong, and unmistakably excited. Robert, is this really you? Robert Morrison, 90 years old, and more alone than anyone should ever be, began to cry. Mary? My dear Mary, is it really you? Oh, Robert, I knew you were alive. I could feel it in my heart that you were still out there, still looking for me, just like I was looking for you. Margaret and David held hands as they listened to the twins reconnect across 6 decades and an ocean. They were witnessing the same miracle that had happened to them, but magnified by the length of separation and the persistence of love. Mary, Robert said through his tears, I have the most wonderful news to share with you. Thomas's children found me. Our nephew had children, and they're here with me right now. There was silence on the other end of the line, and then Mary Morrison's laughter filled the room. The same laugh Robert had been missing for 60 years. now shared with two more family members who had never expected to hear it. The conversation lasted 2 hours, with Mary and Robert sharing decades of experiences, loss, and hope. Near the end, Mary asked to speak with Margaret and David directly. "My dear children," she said, her Scottish accent warm with emotion, "you've given my brother the greatest gift imaginable. When can you all come to Scotland so I can meet you properly?" Margaret looked at David, who nodded immediately. "We'll book flights for next week," Margaret said. "If that's not too soon. 60 years too late is more like it," Mary replied. "But next week will do beautifully." The flight to Edinburgh was Robert Morrison's first time on an airplane, and at 90 years old, he approached it with the wonder of a child and the determination of someone who had waited 60 years for this moment. Margaret had upgraded all of them to first class, but Robert spent most of the 8-hour flight pressed against the window, marveling at the world spread out below. "She's really there," he kept saying, as if he couldn't quite believe it. "Mary is really there, waiting for me." David sat beside him, sharing his own sense of anticipation mixed with nervousness. In the months since finding Margaret, he'd grown comfortable with the idea of having one sibling. The prospect of suddenly having an entire extended family, an aunt who had spent her career reuniting families, an uncle who had never stopped searching, felt both wonderful and overwhelming. Margaret used the flight time to work, but for the first time in her professional life, her mind kept wandering from spreadsheets and reports to more personal considerations. What would Mary be like? Would she approve of the foundation they built? Would she want to be involved in their work, or would she prefer to keep her relationship with them separate from her professional life? "You're overthinking this," David said, noticing her distraction. "I always overthink things. It served me well in business." "This isn't business, Margaret. This is family. You can't strategize your way through family relationships." "Then how do you navigate them?" Margaret asked, realizing that despite her success in every other area of life, she was still learning the basic skills of being someone's sister, someone's niece. "You show up authentically and hope for the best," David replied. "You trust that love will figure out the details." Mary Morrison met them at Edinburgh Airport with a smile that was unmistakably Robert's, the same warmth in her eyes, the same way of tilting her head when she was trying not to cry. At 89, she moved with the energy of someone much younger, and when she saw Robert walking through the arrival gate, she ran to him despite the arthritis Margaret noticed in her hands. "My dear brother," Mary said, holding Robert's face in her palms. "You look exactly the same, just with more wrinkles. You're as beautiful as ever, Mary. I told you that you would be." Margaret and David hung back, giving the twins their moment, but Mary quickly turned her attention to them. "And you two," she said, opening her arms wide, "come here to your aunt." Mary immediately. Her hug was warm and strong, and Margaret felt something she hadn't expected, the sense of being welcomed not just as an individual, but as part of something larger than herself. This was what extended family felt like, she realized. This was belonging that went beyond the nuclear unit she and David had created. Mary's apartment in Edinburgh's Old Town was small but filled with the same kind of family documentation that had covered Robert's walls in Seattle. Photographs of missing children, reunion stories, thank you letters from families she'd helped bring together over her 40-year career as a family advocate. "I started this work because of you, Robert," Mary explained as she made tea for everyone. "Every family I helped reunite was practice for finding you. Every success gave me hope that our turn would come." She pulled out a thick scrapbook filled with newspaper clippings, official letters, and photographs. "I documented every lid, every dead end, every moment when I thought I might have found you. Look at this." The scrapbook contained decades of searching letters to American embassies, correspondence with immigration offices, Advertisements placed in newspapers around the world. Margaret realized that Mary's persistence made her own business success look modest by comparison. "Mary," David said, studying a letter dated 1987, "you placed an ad in the Seattle Times looking for Robert Morrison." That was the year Margaret graduated from college. "I'd placed ads in newspapers all over America every year for 20 years, Mary replied. "I stopped when the internet became available, and I could search more efficiently online." "We might have seen it," Margaret said wonderingly. "If we'd been reading the Seattle Times in 1987, we might have connected you with Robert 30 years ago. But then you two wouldn't have found each other first," Mary pointed out. "And perhaps Robert and I needed to wait until we were old enough to appreciate what we were getting back." Over dinner that night, Mary shared her life story, how she'd been taken in by a Scottish family during the war, educated at Edinburgh University, and built a career helping displaced children find their families. She'd never married, she explained, because she'd never met anyone who understood her need to keep searching for Robert. "I told every suitor the same thing," she said with a mischievous smile. "I said, I come with a brother somewhere in the world, and someday I'm going to find him. If you can't accept that my heart has room for both love and hope, then you're not the right man for me." "Did any of them accept it?" Margaret asked. "A few tried, but they always grew impatient with my searching. They wanted me to give up, too. Accept that Robert was probably dead and move on with my life. I couldn't do that." Robert reached across the table and took his sister's hand. "I'm so sorry you spent your life alone because of me." "I wasn't alone because of you," Mary corrected firmly. "I was alone by choice, because finding you was more important to me than finding romance. And I was never truly alone. I had all the families I helped, all the children who became my surrogate sons and daughters." As the evening progressed, Margaret began to understand that Mary Morrison was more than just their newly discovered aunt. She was a master of the work they'd been learning to do, someone who had been perfecting family reunification techniques for decades before they'd even known their own family story. "Mary," Margaret said carefully, "David and I have built a foundation in Seattle that does similar work to what you've been doing here. Would you be interested in consulting with us? Sharing your expertise?" Mary's eyes lit up. "You mean work together? Combine our resources and experience?" "I mean create an international network," Margaret replied, the business strategist in her recognizing an opportunity to expand their impact exponentially. "Connect families across continents, not just within countries. The Chen Morrison Foundation," David suggested, "honoring both sides of our family history." Mary and Robert exchanged glances, and Margaret could see decades of shared communication. "In that single look, we accept," Mary said simply. "Robert and I have been separated for 60 years, but we've both been doing the same work from different sides of the world. It's time to combine our efforts." The next morning, Margaret woke early and found Mary already up, sitting by her window with a cup of tea and a photograph in her hands. It was the same picture of young Mary that Robert had kept on his wall, a serious 10-year-old with dark hair and determined eyes. "Do you know what I was thinking when that photograph was taken?" Mary asked as Margaret joined her at the window. "What?" "I was thinking that someday I would find Robert again, and when I did, I would tell him everything that had happened to me while we were apart. Every birthday, every Christmas, every important moment, I would save them all up and share them with him." Margaret looked out at Edinburgh's ancient skyline, thinking about her own decades of accumulated experiences, the stories she was still learning to share with David. "Did you tell him everything last night?" "Oh no," Mary laughed. "Last night was just the beginning. We have 60 years of stories to catch up on, and I intend to savor every single one. That's the gift of finding family late in life. You don't take any of it for granted." Later that day, The four of them visited Edinburgh Castle, and Margaret watched Robert and Mary explore it together with the enthusiasm of children on their first adventure. They held hands as they climbed the ancient steps, pointed out historical details to each other, and posed for photographs like tourists who had all the time in the world. "They're healing," David observed as they watched the twins examine a medieval cannon. "They're healing 60 years of separation by being together now. Are we healing too?" Margaret asked. "From our 30 years apart?" "Every day," David replied. "Every single day." On their last evening in Edinburgh, Mary prepared a traditional Scottish dinner and invited them to participate in a family tradition she'd maintained even during her decades alone. "Every year on our birthday," she explained, "I light 2 candles, one for me and one for Robert. I make 2 wishes, one for my own year ahead and one for his, wherever he was. Tonight I want us to light 4 candles, one for each of us, and make wishes for our first year as a reunited family." They gathered around Mary's small dining table as she placed 4 candles in the center and lit them one by one. The warm light flickered across their faces, and Margaret was struck by how much they all resembled each other. The same determined chin, the same expressive eyes, the same way of leaning forward when they were moved by emotion. "Robert first," Mary said. "What's your wish for our family's first year together?" Robert closed his eyes, thinking for a long moment. "I wish for time," he said finally. "Enough time to make up for some of what we lost. Enough time to build new memories together. Enough time to appreciate this miracle we've been given." "David, I wish for the courage to keep growing," David said. "To keep learning how to be a good brother, a good nephew, a good partner in the work we're building together." "Margaret?" Margaret looked around the table at her family, her brother, her uncle, her aunt, and felt overwhelmed by the richness of what they created from the simple question David had asked outside a cafe 7 months earlier. "I wish for wisdom," she said. "The wisdom to use our resources well, to help other families without losing sight of our own, to honor the people who loved us and lost us by loving each other well now." "And I," Mary said, "wish for the courage to believe that this is real. That you're all really here, that I'm not dreaming this after 60 years of hoping." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the candles burn down, each lost in their own thoughts about the improbable journey that had brought them together. Later, as they prepared to return to Seattle, Mary pulled Margaret aside for a private conversation. "I want you to know," Mary said, "that what you and David have built is extraordinary. Not just the foundation, but your relationship with each other. The way you balance independence with interdependence. The way you support each other without losing your individual identities. That's what family should be." "We're still learning," Margaret replied. "Every day, we're still figuring out how to be siblings." "That's the secret," Mary said with a smile. "Real family relationships aren't something you achieve once and then maintain. They're something you choose to create fresh every day, with every interaction, every conversation, every act of love." As their plane lifted off from Edinburgh the next morning, Margaret looked down at the city where her aunt lived and worked, where her uncle had finally found the sister he'd spent 60 years searching for. In a few hours, they would be back in Seattle, back to the Foundation's growing caseload, back to helping other families find their way home. But they were returning as more than they had been when they left. They were returning as part of something larger than themselves, connected not just to each other, but to a legacy of love that stretched across decades and continents. 1 year after, David Chen asked Margaret Chen for her leftovers outside Café Luna. They stood in the same spot, but everything had changed. The cafe had become the Seattle headquarters of the Chun Morrison Foundation, its walls covered with photographs of reunited families from around the world. Margaret had purchased the building 6 months earlier, not as a business investment, but as a monument to the question that had started everything. The morning sun streamed through the same windows where David had once pressed his face, watching strangers eat food he couldn't afford. Now he stood inside those windows as co-director of an organization that had reunited over 200 families. In his first year of operation, he wore a suit that fit him perfectly, carried himself with the confidence of someone who knew his worth, and smiled with the easy contentment of a man who had found his purpose. Margaret sat at a corner table, reviewing quarterly reports that showed the foundation's work expanding to 12 cities across 3 countries. But the numbers that mattered most to her weren't in any report. They were the photographs that arrived weekly from families who had found each other, the thank you letters that filled filing cabinets, the phone calls from social workers who said the foundation's resources had helped them keep families together. Elena Vasquez approached their table with a familiar manila folder. After a year of working together, Margaret could read Elena's expressions accurately, and today she saw excitement mixed with something deeper. "I have a case that I think you'll both want to hear about personally," Elena said, settling into the chair beside them. She opened the folder to reveal a photograph of 3 children, 2 boys and a girl, maybe 7, 5, and 3 years old. They were standing in front of a Christmas tree, arms around each other, grinning at the camera with the unconscious joy of children who had never known anything but love. "The Jackson siblings," Elena explained. "They were separated 18 months ago when their grandmother, who was raising them, had a stroke and could no longer care for them. The oldest boy, Marcus, is in a foster home in Tacoma. The middle child, a girl named Sophia, was placed with a family in Spokane. The youngest, a boy named Leo, is in temporary care in Portland." Margaret studied the photograph, seeing something achingly familiar in the way the children held on to each other. "What makes this case special? Marcus has been walking," Elena said softly. "Just like the boy you told me about from your social work days. He's been trying to walk from Tacoma to Spokane to find his sister. He's been picked up by police 4 times in the past 6 months." David sat down heavily, the parallel hitting him like a physical blow. "How far has he walked?" "The farthest he got was 37 miles before they found him. He was carrying a backpack with pictures of his siblings and a note that said, 'Please help me find Sophia and Leo. We promised Grandma we would stay together.'" Margaret felt her chest tighten with the same emotions that had driven her out of social work decades earlier. But this time, instead of feeling helpless, she felt the power that came from having resources and experience. "What do they need?" she asked. "The system wants to keep them separated because they're all in stable placements now. But none of the foster families are willing to take all 3 children. And there's no legal requirement to keep siblings together if they're not being abused or neglected." "There should be," David said firmly. "There should be a legal requirement to exhaust every option before separating siblings." "I agree," Elena said. "But right now, we work within the system that exists, not the one we wish we had." Margaret was quiet for a long moment, thinking. Then she pulled out her phone and made a call. "Janet, I need you to clear my schedule for the rest of the week. And I need you to call our lawyer. I want to know what it would take to become licensed as an emergency placement for children in the foster care system." David looked at her with understanding dawning in his eyes. "Margaret, are you suggesting—" "I'm suggesting that we take them," Margaret said simply. "All 3 of them. Temporarily, until we can find them a permanent family that wants to keep them together. But they're not spending another night separated, if I can help it." Elena's eyes widened. "Margaret, that's incredible. But are you prepared for what it means to have 3 traumatized children living with you?" "No," Margaret admitted. "I'm not prepared at all. But David and I were 3 traumatized children once, and what we needed most was each other. Maybe that's exactly the preparation we need." Within 24 hours, Margaret had obtained emergency foster care certification. and the Jackson siblings were sitting in her penthouse apartment, staring out at the Seattle skyline with expressions of wonder and disbelief. Marcus was indeed 8 years old, with serious eyes that held too much responsibility for someone so young. Sophia was 6, chatty and resilient, but she hadn't let go of her brother's hand since they've been reunited. Leo was 4, shy and thumb-sucking, but his face had lit up the moment he saw his siblings again. "Is this real?" Marcus asked Margaret, as she showed them to the bedrooms she'd hastily converted from her home office and exercise room. "Are we really going to stay together? For as long as it takes to find you a permanent family that wants all 3 of you," Margaret promised. "And Marcus, you don't have to walk anywhere anymore. You don't have to take care of everyone by yourself. That's what adults are for." David, who had moved into Margaret's guest room to help with the children, found his calling. In those first chaotic weeks, he taught Leo to ride a bicycle in the building's parking garage, helped Sophia with her homework, and spent hours listening to Marcus talk about his fears, his hopes, and his fierce determination to protect his younger siblings. "You remind me of someone," Margaret told Marcus one evening as she tucked him into bed. "Someone who spent 30 years taking care of his sister, even when he didn't know where she was." "Who?" Marcus asked. "My brother David. And do you know what I learned about him?" Marcus shook his head. "I learned that the people who take care of others deserve to be taken care of too. You've been very brave, Marcus, but now it's time to let the grown-ups be brave for you." 3 months later, Elena called with news that made everyone cry happy tears. A family in Portland, the Hendersons, had been looking to adopt siblings for 2 years. They'd been turned down by agencies because they specifically wanted children who came as a set, believing that siblings should never be separated. "They have a 4-bedroom house, a big backyard, and they're both teachers," Elena reported. "They've been waiting for children exactly like Marcus, Sophia, and Leo." The transition was gradual and careful, with multiple visits and overnight stays to ensure that the match was right for everyone. Margaret found herself unexpectedly emotional about letting the children go, but she knew they needed the permanence and stability that she and David couldn't provide long-term. On the day of the final placement, Marcus hugged Margaret tightly. "Will you still be my friend even when I have new parents?" "I'll be your friend forever," Margaret promised. "And if you ever need anything at all, you call me." That's what family friends do for each other. As the Henderson family drove away with the 3 Jackson siblings safe and together in their back seat, Margaret and David stood on the sidewalk outside Café Luna, watching until the car disappeared around the corner. "We did it," David said softly. "We kept the family together." "We did more than that," Margaret replied. "We proved that the system can work when people care enough to make it work." That evening, as they cleaned up the children's temporary bedrooms, David found a drawing that Marcus had left under his pillow. It showed 5 stick figures holding hands, 3 small ones labeled Marcus, Sophia, and Leo, and 2 taller ones labeled Margaret and David. At the top, in careful 8-year-old handwriting, Marcus had written, "My family friends." 6 months later, the Chen Morrison Foundation had expanded its mission to include emergency placement services for siblings at risk of separation. Margaret's penthouse had been converted to a temporary residential facility, and they'd hired a full-time staff of social workers and childcare specialists. They'd also begun lobbying for legislative changes to prioritize keeping siblings together, with Robert and Mary testifying before Congress about the long-term impact of family separation. On the first anniversary of their reunion, Margaret and David stood once again outside Café Luna, but this time they weren't alone. Robert had flown in from Seattle, where he now lived in a small apartment near the Foundation's headquarters. Mary had come from Edinburgh, where she was establishing the European branch of their organization. Elena was there, along with dozens of families they'd helped reunite over the past year. The Hendersons had driven up from Portland with Marcus, Sophia, and Leo, who ran to hug Margaret and David before joining the other children in the crowd. Carmen had brought her 3 brothers, all of whom now lived within 20 miles of each other in California. Robert's friend from the first day, the elderly man searching for his sister, was there with Mary, not his sister Mary, but his newly discovered sister Mary, a woman who had been living 2 states away under a married name for 40 years. "I want to say something," Margaret announced to the gathered crowd. "A year ago, my brother asked me a simple question. Could I eat your leftovers? That question changed both our lives, but more importantly, it taught us that sometimes the most profound connections begin with the smallest acts of kindness." She looked at David, who nodded encouragingly. "Today, I want to ask all of you a question. What if the person you're looking for is closer than you think? What if they're the stranger you pass on the street, the coworker you barely notice, the person whose story you've never bothered to learn?" David stepped forward. "We learned that family isn't just about blood or genetics. Family is about choosing to see each other, choosing to stay connected, choosing to show up for each other, even when it's difficult. The Chen Morrison Foundation exists because we believe that everyone deserves to belong somewhere," Margaret continued. "Everyone deserves to be seen, to be remembered, to be missed when they're gone. If our story has taught us anything, it's that love is stronger than time, stronger than distance, stronger than the systems that try to keep us apart." Mary Morrison, now 89 and still sharp as ever, raised her hand. "I'd like to add something, if I may." "Of course, Aunt Mary. Robert and I spent 60 years searching for each other. Margaret and David spent 30 years apart. But the children we've helped this year, they won't have to search for decades. They won't have to spend their adult lives wondering if they belong somewhere. That's not just a gift to them. That's a gift to the future, to generations of families who will stay connected because of the work we're doing now." As the sun set over Seattle, the crowd began to disperse. Families heading home to dinners and bedtime stories, and all the ordinary miracles of daily life together. Margaret and David were among the last to leave, standing in the same spot where they'd met, but no longer as strangers asking for help. "Are you happy?" David asked, using the same words Margaret had asked him months earlier. "I'm more than happy," Margaret replied. "I'm home. For the first time in my life, I'm truly home. Even though we live in different apartments now, home isn't the place," Margaret said, smiling at her brother. "Home is knowing that somewhere in the world, there are people who would notice if you disappeared. Home is knowing that your story matters to someone else." As they walked toward their separate cars, David called back to her. "Margaret?" "Yes?" "Tomorrow, would you like to have lunch together? I know a good café." Margaret laughed, the sound carrying across the evening air like the answer to a question that had taken 30 years to ask. "I'd love that, Davy. I'd love that very much." The next morning, as Margaret drove to work at the foundation headquarters, she passed the corner where David had once sat with nothing but hope and hunger. Now that corner held a small plaque that read, "In memory of all the families searching for each other and in celebration of all the families who find their way home." She thought about the children sleeping safely in the residential facility upstairs, the investigators working on active cases around the world, the families who were waking up together for the first time in years because of questions asked and answered with love. But mostly, she thought about the simple truth that had started everything. Sometimes the people we're meant to love are closer than we think, waiting for us to be brave enough to ask the right question, generous enough to give the right answer, and wise enough to recognize that every stranger carries the possibility of becoming family. Margaret Chen had spent 42 years building walls around her heart, convinced that independence was safer than connection. Now she knew better. Now she knew that the greatest success of her life would always be the moment she chose to see her brother not as a problem to be solved, but as a person to be loved. In her office, surrounded by the photographs of reunited families and the sound of children's laughter from upstairs, Margaret opened her laptop and began typing her daily report. But today, instead of starting with statistics and outcomes, she began with gratitude. Today marks 1 year since David asked me for my leftovers. Today marks 1 year since I learned that the most important question in the world isn't what can you do for me, but what can we do for each other. Today marks 1 year since I came home.